Chapter 5. The people, by the saint's advice, offer themselves by vow to Saint Sebastian. Further provisions against the plague. 1576. The anger of God was not yet appeased, and his scourge still hung over the city, notwithstanding the prayers and penances of the people and their pastor. From day to day the plague spot appeared in some fresh place, till the whole city might be said to be steeped in the disease, and it became necessary to devise some new means against its progress. It was in this crisis that the unflinching faith of St. Charles was seen. Though the wrath of God seemed unappeased, and his judgments to fall heavier, the more earnestly the people prayed, his trust never faltered for an instant. When the pestilence was devouring his flock, he continued steadfast in his faith that God would ere long deliver them. Full of this assurance, just at the time when the outlook seemed most hopeless, he one day in a sermon in the cathedral promised them that if they only continued their practice of penance and purpose of amendment, the plague would disappear from among them before Christmastide. This prophecy was much discussed at the time, and when it was fulfilled by the event, it was freely acknowledged that only the Spirit of God could have revealed it to him, as all probability, so far from bearing him out, told directly against him, as new cases of contagion were published daily. As his confidence was invincible, so also was it altogether free from presumption, and he was not deterred from continuing his prayers by his foreknowledge of returning health, or discouraged at the moment by their seeming fruitlessness. He was always urging the people to increase the fervor of their prayers, and was ever giving them fresh opportunities of enkindling their devotion. Though all that men receive through the intercessions of the saints is from the hand of God, yet he knew well it is his good pleasure to work by means of instruments, and that the genius and intellect of man is given to serve him in difficulties and trials. When every effort seemed to have failed, he recommended them to make a particular application to the glorious martyr Saint Sebastian, who was held in special honor by the Milanese as a native of their city. His intercession had before this time put an end to the ravages of pestilence in the pontificate of Saint Adeodatus, A.D. 672, when Rome was desolated by this terrible scourge, and the dead lay in heaps in the public ways, and nothing stayed its virulence till an altar was erected to Saint Sebastian in the church of Saint Peter ad Vincula. Following this example, St. Charles encouraged the Milanese to make a solemn promise to restore the ruined church of the saint, to provide for the celebration of a daily mass there in perpetuity, to keep his feast with due honor, and the vigil as a fast, to make a solemn procession on the anniversary of this day, October 15th, for 10 successive years, and every year on his feast day. In making this vow, we see that St. Charles had two objects chiefly in view: to increase the veneration paid to the saint, and to keep up in the minds of the people the remembrance of their deliverance, as an incentive to watchfulness against those sins which had provoked the infliction. The worst was not yet, however, over. The hospital of St. Gregory was filled to overflowing, and numbers daily applied for admission. In union with the municipality, St. Charles decided upon adopting two important sanitary measures. The first was to construct temporary hospitals for the sick in the country at some distance from the city, 6 in number, corresponding to the 6 districts, defended by ditches and walls, so as to prevent communication between the sick and the sound. The other was the establishment of quarantine within the city, in order to restrict all intercourse leading to the spread of contagion. The condition of the city at this time was so wretched that it recalled the lamentations of Jeremiah over Jerusalem. St. Charles himself thus describes it: "The city might at this time be likened to that great tree which was shown to Nebuchadnezzar in a dream, reaching to heaven, and spreading out its branches to the end of the earth. O city of Milan, so wast thou in the days of thy greatness exalted to heaven, and thy riches penetrated unto the utmost parts of the world. Men and beasts and fowls of the air were nourished by thine abundance. Peasants came from afar to labor under thy shade, and nobles delighted to take up their abode in thy palaces. But now how is thy wantonness and pride suddenly cast down, so that thou art become a byword in the mouths of men? Thou art shut up within thy walls, thy wares and thy merchandise are cut off. None come any more to dwell with thee, to enjoy thy fruits, and to traffic in thy markets, nor even to adorn themselves with thine inventions, nor to learn of thee new fashions of vanity. But thou art shunned alike by gentle and simple. Thou canst tempt no one by thy pleasures or riches to meet the poison of thy breath. How great is the misery of those who must perforce dwell with thee! If they escape the ravages of the pestilence, few there are who are not numbered among the suspected and banished to the discomforts of the hospital, or, what is worse, obliged to crave a shelter in the huts without the walls, where they are lucky if they find straw to lie upon, the greater number having to sleep under the dew of heaven, in the haunts of beasts, where soldiers hem them in, lest they should carry the plague spot elsewhere. What more need be said? Thy streets and public places are deserted, thy churches are empty, thy markets closed, thy houses left desolate. O Milan, famished and hard-pressed, begging aid from villages and hamlets around that once depended upon thee, how art thou humbled and brought low by the sudden shaft from the hand of God. From these words of the saint, we may gather how great was the distress in which this once thriving city found itself. We have it on his authority that there were as many as 60 or 70,000 poor, who, being thrown out of employment by the stagnation of trade and failure of the ordinary channels of labor, were dependent upon the alms of the charitable for their daily bread. This was, of course, a heavy drain on the public purse, and the controllers of the city found themselves obliged to borrow money on the security of the tolls and customs. Throughout this extremity, the saint continued his almsgiving without reserve, though forced to embarrass his income for many years in advance, and was constantly reduced to such straits that his steward had often to go now to one, now to another, to beg means for the day's expenses, as if he had himself been one of the poorest. And though often hard beset, he was never abandoned by the providence of God, in whom he implicitly trusted, and who often aided him miraculously in times of greatest need. This was manifested particularly on one occasion. He had been busy the whole day providing for the necessities of the destitute. On returning home in the evening, he found there was nothing in the larder for his own household, and no means of obtaining any provisions, everything having been distributed among the poor. The saint withdrew without a word to his own apartment, in all probability to pray, while his chamberlains and assistants in the labors of this trying period stood around with arms crossed, supperless, yet never doubting that God would provide for them. Just at this moment, a person of consideration knocked at the door, accompanied by a porter carrying a bag of 1,000 crowns, and requested an audience of the cardinal, at whose feet he laid the money as an offering. This gave great consolation to the household, as being a wonderful instance of the care of God for them. These favors from heaven caused the saint to exercise greater charity still towards those in distress, and to urge those who had means at command to do the same. In many instances his exhortations had the best results, the wealthy often despoiling themselves of their most valuable effects, that they might have more to give away. Among the most benevolent was Pomponio Giussano and his brother Agostino. The number of the needy continued, however, to increase in the long season of distress, and Milan, no longer able to provide for their necessities, was forced to have recourse to the neighboring cities and towns for aid. Many of them responded with alacrity to this appeal. the store of provisions contributed by the people of Casalmaggiore gave most seasonable succor, and was particularly worthy of remembrance, as a mark both of generosity and loyalty. While the cardinal busied himself in behalf of the suffering members of his flock, his charity was seen most especially in his solicitude for the poor little ones who lost their mothers in the plague. When it was impossible to find foster mothers for them all, he had them supplied with goat's milk. These little nurslings were his especial charge, and he took particular pleasure in rescuing them wherever he came across them. For sometimes when going round the city by night, he descried them on doorsteps, sometimes lying by the side of dead bodies of their parents. But wherever they might be, they always received at his hands the care and tenderness of a father.